Greetings, AP European History Scholars. We're looking at the review sheet for Unit 3, and the topic here is Constitutional Monarchy versus Absolute Monarchy. And starting at the top of the review sheet with Louis XIV, he is the definition of the quintessential divine right monarch. And he's famous for this famous quote, "L'État c'est moi, I am the state." For Louis, there was no sharing power with elected parliaments, with the church, with townsmen, with nobles, and this idea is called divine right. And one of the proponents in France is Jacques Bossuet, who defended absolute rule, that this is a God-given right and that the king is absolute. And to enforce this power, Louis XIV set up what was called the intendant system, and the intendants were royal officials who would go through the provinces and who would visit and who would inspect and would hold the nobles accountable. And they were, as it were, the eyes and the ears. They were the spies of the King of France, enforcing royal absolutism far and wide in France. The Edict of Fontainebleau overturned the Edict of Nantes. Remember, the Edict of Nantes is enacted by Henry IV. Remember, Henry IV is the first of the Bourbon kings, and he will marry Margaret, the last of the Valois family. And Henry he's a Huguenot, remember, he's a Calvinist, and he inherits the throne here, and what he does is he converts to Catholicism, the famous phrase, Paris is worth a mass, but as king he allows tolerance for the Huguenots, allowing them to have their own schools, to fortify their towns, to worship freely. And this is not acceptable to Louis XIV, because this implies and allows division in France. If you don't worship as he does, you are de facto in opposition to him. And you will see the exile and the flight of about 250,000 Huguenots to places like England and to the Netherlands as he enforces uniformity of religion in France as part of his absolutism. Versailles is this magnificent palace, the most magnificent palace ever built in Europe by Louis XIV. And the purpose is, on one hand, to display his majesty, his magnificence, his power, his wealth, but also to keep the nobles close to him. He required the nobles, and there are about 10,000 at any given time, living at Versailles. This is a huge palace and town. And the idea is that if you want favor, if you want patronage, if you want a job for your kids in the government, you will not just be on the king's side, but you will literally be in proximity at the king's side. And this fostered a culture of obsequiousness, of fawning, of dependence, and he essentially is emasculating the nobility here. And the great contrast is in Great Britain. In England, in particular, you have the uprising of Parliament, which we will get to, putting the king in his place. The Wars of the Fronde. The Fronde is actually a slingshot, and the rebels against the king in the Wars of the Fronde, some of them would shoot rocks and stuff, and with slingshots. And this nickname was given to a greater war where the nobility are rising up against a young king, and he will succeed in putting the Frondeurs, the War of the Fronde, putting the Frondeurs down. The War of the Fronde is won by Louis XIV. The nobility of the robe versus the nobility of the sword. The nobility of the sword, of course, are those descended from the knights. This is the old blue blood nobility. And to limit their power, to put them in their place, to box them in, and to a certain extent here, the king is setting up what's called the nobility of the robe. And these are those who are wealthy, perhaps mostly in the bourgeoisie, the middle class. These would be lawyers and businessmen and professionals who have money, who have education, who want a title of nobility. And he's diluting the power of the nobility of the sword, and he's also gaining a revenue stream for himself. Jean-Baptiste Colbert is the proponent of mercantilism, and mercantilism is the idea that the state should regulate trade. And some things that are pieces of mercantilism, one would be subsidizing those industries that you favor for development, such as an armaments industry, an iron industry, and also putting high tariffs on foreign goods to keep them out, so you have a favorable balance of trade. More gold and silver coming into your country rather than going out. The equivalent of Louis XIV, the famous Sun King, who his court revolves around him like the planets revolve around the sun, is Peter the Great in Russia. Peter the Great is an absolutist in the Romanov dynasty, and Peter the Great is going to be famous for militarily looking for warm water ports. And he's going to go to war in the Crimea, and he's going to take the port of Azov on the Black Sea, and he's also going to go to war against Charles the 12th of Sweden, and his goal is to get a port that will not be closed by ice when winter hits. And this great northern war is going to have a number of Russian losses, and it's going to end, of course, with a Russian win against Charles the 12th. So Swedish power will descend and Russian power will rise here. And on the Baltic, you have the building of a brand new city in a swampy area called St. Petersburg. And this is a city built from scratch. And it is going to be named after Peter the Great, who's there's no humility there, of course. And this is a port that is facing the west. And Peter is famous for his attempt at westernizing Russia. He's looking at, he's looking at the French and the English and the Dutch, at their trade, at their wealth, at their urbanization, and he's wanting this for Russia. Before we get to more detail on that, the table of ranks is his ploy to make the boyars, who are the aristocracy in Russia, loyal to him. If you want to rise up in position, patronage, and power, you need to serve him either in the bureaucracy or in the military. And the table of ranks had 14 positions depending upon your loyalty and service to the Tsar, to the King of Russia. And Tsar, of course, is spelled C-Z-A-R or T-S-A-R. This is a translation from the Cyrillic, and this originally comes from, it's a derivation of Caesar, he's the emperor, he's the king of the Russians. The examples of westernization that you often see in history books and videos and things that you watch, Peter would order the boyars to cut their beards. He would order them to wear Western dress, to get out of these kaftans, these sort of bathrobe type garments, and to wear knickers and breeches like Westerners do. He would send the children of noble kids off to Western schools, and he would import Western military officers to train his military, and to bring Western craftsmen in to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And his goal here is to westernize his country. The Orthodox Church is one of the competing powers with the Romanovs, and the Romanov Church sort of instinctively was opposed to change and Western influences. And what Peter's plan here was, and what he did, was to take over the Orthodox Church, to get rid of the Patriarch, to appoint a procurator general accountable to Peter, and he made the church a department of the state with a synod ruling over it instead of the Patriarch. And the synod, of course, is ultimately under this procurator general. The English, in contrast to Louis XIV of France, in contrast to Peter the Great, they are going to develop what's called a constitutional monarchy. This is a monarchy limited by law, limited by shared power with Parliament. And the Tudors are going to literally die out. The Tudor dynasty is going to die with the death of Elizabeth I, the famous quote-unquote virgin queen who didn't marry. Remember, her father, Henry VIII, killed her mother. Anne Boleyn went through 6 wives, and she doesn't want to be beholden to any man, but she has no offspring. So Parliament's got a problem here. They go looking for a new king, and they pick her cousin, who is James VI of Scotland, who is brought down to England, and he becomes James I of England. And he is a Stuart. So the Stuart dynasty replaces the Tudors. And James fancies himself to be an absolute monarch, and he is going to provoke Parliament by his absolutism, one of them being he's demanding religious conformity. Remember, you have these groups, the Puritans, and you have the Presbyterians, and of course you have the Catholics, who are in disagreement with the Anglican Church. And he's got this quote, "No bishop, no king. If you do not conform, if you do not receive my bishop, you are in rebellion against me." And remember, the Puritans are against the Episcopal, the bishop system. They want a more, essentially what's a more democratic or representative system, either a congregational or a Presbyterian form of government, a totally different form of what's called ecclesiology. James I is followed by Charles I, a little error on your review sheet. It should read Charles I, not Charles II. And Charles I is also an absolutist. And by the way, under James and Charles I, in American history, this is when these thousands and thousands and thousands of Puritans are fleeing the Massachusetts for religious freedom against the intolerance of James and Charles I. Charles I is also going to issue what's called a ship tax, and this is permitted by Parliament to raise money for a navy to protect the realm, but he's going to extend the ship tax into the interior of Great Britain, and he's essentially illegally taxing and getting around Parliament, which several times he's going to be shutting down. Now, civil war will break out and in England, and what leads to this is this religious intolerance, the ship tax, but specifically what is going to be the catalyst is Charles I is going to overstep himself, and he's going to try to cram what's called the Book of Common Prayer down the throats of the Scots, who are Presbyterians. Remember, Calvinism enters Scotland by way of John Knox, who is a Calvinist, and the Book of Common Prayer is the liturgical book of the Anglican Church. All Anglicans are literally on the same page every Sunday, and this book is ordered to be the Scots are ordered to conform and follow the Book of Common Prayer, and they will invade England. And the king here is going to, at this time, he's building an army to put down a rebellion in Ireland, and all these things are happening concurrently here. This oppressive government of Charles I. He's also arresting members of Parliament who won't, comply and loan him money and support him, and civil war breaks out, and you have the army of the Roundheads, who are the parliamentary army, and they're called Roundheads. They have this sort of bowl haircut on their heads. The Cavaliers are those aristocrats who are supporting the king, and the New Model Army is this army which famously is based upon merit, not upon your lineage, your family line, and it's going to be led by Oliver Cromwell, and it will defeat the Cavaliers, defeat Charles I, who will be captured and who will be tried and executed. He'll be beheaded, and you're going to have a decade long, a little over that period under Oliver Cromwell, who is a Puritan, essentially a dictator. He calls himself the Lord Protector, and this period of government it has a number of names. It's called the Republic, it's called the Commonwealth, it's called the Protectorate, and as the leader of England, he's a Puritan, and he is intolerant like Charles I before him, only he's a Puritan who will ban Christmas, who will ban taverns, who will ban gambling, who will ban plays. They'll shut down the famous Globe Theater, Shakespeare's theater here. And once he's dead, there's going to be a desire to bring the Stuarts back. Parliament will bring back the son of Charles I, James II, and this is called the Restoration. Now, I've jumped down a little on the review sheet. We covered the ship tax, which was the sort of the illegal extension of a limited tax at the port into the interior of England. The episcopacy is this government by bishops, which is kind of Catholic-y. Remember, when Henry takes over the church, he's not changing the government of the church because he merely wants a son. He's not doing this for theological reasons. The Puritans want to get rid of what they consider to be an unbiblical form of government. And Scotland here is the part of Great Britain where the king is ill-advisedly forcing them to be participants in Anglican worship, and they will invade. And this is what will sort of spark the war here as Charles is weakened. The similarity here with Charles I and Oliver Cromwell is they're both religiously intolerant. Now, and when James II dies, he has no surviving children. It goes to his brother, James II. James II is a Catholic. James II is married to a Catholic, and he has a Catholic son. And Parliament at this point is worried that he'll pull a Bloody Mary, that he's going to try to reimpose Catholicism, because he's also fancying himself to be an absolute monarch. And here you have the Glorious Revolution, 1688. This is a really important date. Perhaps maybe with Magna Carta, the most important date in the political history of the English-speaking world, where Parliament will be supreme after this. It's a bloodless revolution. The King, James II, will flee to France, and they will bring over his Protestant daughter Mary, who's married to the Calvinist ruler of the Netherlands, the Stadtholder William of Orange. They will come over, and it'll be sort of a co-regency, and they will agree to sign a Bill of Rights, which is essentially saying Parliament has the right to meet without being shut down, the right to petition, the right of free speech. There will be the right of Parliament to approve all taxation. So you have, after this, Parliament is really at least a co-ruler and eventually the ultimate ruler of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. A list here of dynasties which you should know. The Hohenzollerns are the Prussians, the Fredericks there in Prussia, which is ascending in power. The Habsburgs are the Austrian, it's the Austrian dynasty, and also the dynasty in Spain until the War of Spanish Succession, in which case there will be a Bourbon line in Spain. The Bourbons are the dynasty in France, the Romanovs in Russia, and the Ottomans over there in Asia Minor. Vienna, 1683, Suleiman the Magnificent is knocking at the door militarily at Vienna, and the Muslims, the Ottomans, have, over time here, they have taken over what would be Greece and Albania and Bulgaria and Romania and Serbia and Croatia and Slovenia and Hungary, and they are going to be repelled, and there's going to be the slow retreat and erosion of Ottoman rule over the next 200 years. Make no mistake, Islam is not a religion of peace. You have a major invasion and occupation of Europe, and its farthest reach is Vienna, and they're pushed back by a combined Polish and German army. Difference between the Netherlands and France, several questions in recent years, some involving paintings. France is this, it's the quintessential, it's the example of an absolutist regime where the nobles are definitely subordinate to the king, who is superior in every way. They're fawning over him, they're kneeling in front of him, and they're at his side, at his beck and call. And there's religious intolerance. In the Netherlands, you have the opposite. You have a stadtholder who, in time of military necessity, is given sort of temporary military power and authority over the army, but the Netherlands is made up of these independent states. And remember, when the Netherlands rebels against Spain, the northern 7 provinces, or they're called the United Provinces, the 7 northern provinces will become an independent Netherlands. And the provinces here are ruled by councils, by sort of an oligarchy of the wealthy. Cities have town councils, and you have shared power here in the Netherlands. You don't have anything like a divine right ruler. And the Netherlands is unique in that it is very much a merchant, trading, industrial economy, and the century of the 1600s is the golden age of the Dutch, and they have more ships than anybody, bigger navy, and they're all over the place. They're in Africa, they're in India. They take from the Portuguese what would be the East Indies, Indonesia, and the Dutch are just phenomenally wealthy. And they're urban, and they are famous for the religious tolerance. Intolerance is very bad for business. They're highly educated, and it's just a real contrast with France. And the basis of wealth, again, is this trade here. And think back on the Renaissance. The Northern Renaissance is being funded by the wealth of this trade along the Baltic and the North Sea, where the Dutch and the Belgians are the southern part of the Netherlands. They're the other 10 provinces out of the original 17, and they will stay Catholic and become future Belgium. But this is an area of great prosperity based upon sea trade. Why the decline of Spanish power in the 1600s? Well, imperial overstretch. The Spanish have this huge empire. They've got a military all over the place, and they famously fail to subdue a Calvinist revolt in the Netherlands. And at the end of the 30 Years' War, the Treaty of Westphalia will guarantee the Netherlands independence. And the Spanish will also fail in their invasion of England in 1588. And Spain also, they don't industrialize, and they sort of miss out here on the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment, and ultimately the Industrial Revolution. So Spanish power will really eclipse here in this time period. Baroque art is art. The purpose here is to glorify either the ruler of the state, or the ruler of the state, or the Catholic Church. And the contrast here is this iconoclasm of the Calvinists under Zwingli and under Calvin, which saw religious art as being idolatrous And you have the iconoclasm as the destruction of images, of stained glass, of statues, of pictures, of icons. And the contrary here in the Catholic Church, kind of this defiance that art is something that glorifies God, that reflects his majesty. And these Catholic churches are going to be, when you walk into a Catholic church in Europe and it's dripping with gold and silver and pictures, this is probably Baroque art. And the purpose here is to show the glory of God, and the counterpart here is art that glorifies usually Catholic absolute royal kings. And two artists you should know here are Bernini, who two of his most famous works are these sculptures. One is David, and there's that David, the guy who kills Goliath. And you see the statue; it's pivoting. He's got this. He's moving into the space of the viewer, and he's got this sling with a rock in it. He's biting his lip. And one of the characteristics of Baroque art is it draws the viewer in as a participant. It's sort of art that's in motion, if it's sculpture. And there's another artwork you should know, the Ecstasy of Saint Therese, or Saint Teresa. She is the Carmelite reformer who starts this order of the Discalced Carmelites during the Catholic Reformation. And in this piece of art, he's showing you this woman who is enraptured. She's in ecstasy. Her heart has been pierced by this golden spear being thrust by this angel. There is in this piece of, it's kind of a collection of statues here, her and this angel who's bringing the love of God. Her heart is being enraptured by love of Christ. And it's really an exquisitely detailed, and it's this woman who's just in the throes of passion, and it's drawing you in. And when you walk into the church here, there's another kind of a frieze. It's a sculpture that's been carved into the wall here of these men who are looking at the statue of Therese and the angel. So when you walk into the church, you're being brought into what are these guys looking at, and you turn your head and you see the ecstasy. The Night Watch of Rembrandt, this is a northern artist, and the Night Watch is this painting surrounded by darkness, and sort of in the center is spotlighted with light. And it's as it were, a sort of the National Guard, the town Minutemen, you might call them. These are the sort of the militia of this town, are going out on a night patrol, and they're rowdy, they're boisterous. There's a gun going off behind one guy's head, not killing him, of course, but these guys are just ill-disciplined, and it's representing the freedom, the boisterousness of the Dutch, who are proudly independent and free. Effective use of state power, Elizabeth I defeats the Spanish Armada, at least her navy does, in 1588, and she is famous for her via media, her relative religious tolerance in an age of intolerance, and she's watching the wars of religion tear apart Germany and the Holy Roman Empire and the French Wars of Religion, and she's not having any part of this. She is going to be this golden age of Great Britain, of prosperity, the growth of towns, of Shakespeare, and this is all under her. She uses her power in a very guarded way. Henry IV is the Huguenot who becomes the King of France, who converts to Catholicism. Paris is worth a mass, and he issues the Edict of Nantes. Catherine the Great is another westernizer of Russia, and she is going to try to spread education, and she's going to try to spread the borders of France, and she's going to have this correspondence with Voltaire. And both Catherine and Peter they want to westernize, they want education, they want prosperity without giving up personal power, and sometimes you call her what's called an enlightened monarch or an enlightened despot. And Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, is going to support industrialization. He's going to support, small industry, of course, at this time. He's going to support education. He's going to support religious tolerance. He's going to support the codification of the law, the centralization of the legal system. And he's going to have what's called the General Directory, and this is going to be something like the table of ranks, where to have rank, to have position, you have to be loyal to him. And he's going to develop a military which is disproportionately powerful and kind of co-equivalent with the government in many ways. Some people call Prussia a military in possession of a state rather than vice versa. One reason why Germany collectively is weak, now Prussia will be growing more strong. Germany up until 1870-71 is divided between these fiercely individualistic, independent German rulers. And Germany will be divided like Italy until the 1870s. Poland has a what's called a Sejm, S-E-J-M, and this is a parliament in which any Polish noble could veto any proposed law, any action here. And the fierce independence of the Poles will lead to lack of unity, which causes them to be the prey of surrounding powers, namely the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians will literally divide them up. And they will lose their existence as an independent state. So there you have it. Do look over the review sheet. All these things reflect questions on the test that you will have. Look over the notes, look over your book, look over review material. And if you have any questions, see me before we meet to test. Otherwise, study and carry on.